The light turned red. And in that one ordinary second, the kind of second that passes 1,000 times in a lifetime without meaning anything, everything changed. A woman in a black SUV sat behind the wheel, fingers tapping absently against the leather, mind somewhere between her next meeting and her grocery list. The afternoon sun was brutal. Heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves. Around her, car engines idled. A bus exhaled loudly, and somewhere in the distance, a horn honked twice. She wasn't really looking at anything. She was just waiting. And then she saw him, an old man, moving slowly between the stopped cars. He was wearing a faded blue shirt soaked through with sweat, trousers that were too big for his thinning frame, and worn-out shoes that seemed to protest every step. In his hands, he carried a small red cooler. A handwritten cardboard sign dangled from the handle. It read, "Ice cream, $1." He moved with the particular dignity of a man who had long since made peace with something painful. He didn't look up much. He didn't beg. He simply walked, pausing at each window, lifting the cooler gently as if to say, "I have something. Would you like it?" Most drivers didn't even glance his way. The woman in the SUV watched him approach her lane. She reached for her phone, and then stopped. Something about the way he walked, something about the curve of his shoulders, something about the way he tilted his head slightly to the right when a driver shook their head at him. Her hand went cold. She leaned forward in her seat. Her eyes narrowed. And then the old man looked up. For one suspended, breathless moment, their eyes met through the windshield. The phone slipped from her fingers. Because the man selling ice cream in traffic, the man in the worn shoes and the soaked shirt and the quiet dignity, was her father. Her 70-year-old father, a man she had not spoken to in 19 years. She stopped breathing. Before we go any further into this story, drop a comment right now and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We truly love hearing from our community all around the globe. And if you're new here, and this story is already pulling at something inside you, click that subscribe button right now, so you never miss another story like this one. Stories about real life, about family, about the moments we never see coming. Now, let's go back. Her name was Diana Osei, 44 years old, regional director of a mid-sized logistics company, owner of the black SUV, the sensible blazer, the carefully managed life. She had a condo on the 23rd floor with a view of the skyline, and a calendar so full it sometimes felt less like a life and more like a schedule. She was, by every measure that the world tends to use, successful. But in that moment, parked at a red light on a Thursday afternoon, watching her elderly father shuffle between cars with a cooler of melting ice, cream, every one of those measures felt like a joke, flat and hollow and meaningless, like a building whose walls were beautiful, but whose foundation had been quietly crumbling for years. She didn't move. She couldn't move. The man outside her window, her father, hadn't recognized her yet. He was now at the car directly ahead of her. She watched him tap gently on the passenger window, watched the occupant roll it down, watched her father smile and reach into the cooler. The exchange was quick. A few coins, a small ice cream bar wrapped in white paper. Her father nodded his thanks with the graciousness of a man who had once hosted entire families at his dinner table. His name was Emmanuel Osei, once a man of standing, once a man of immense quiet strength, and here he was. Here he was. The light turned green. Diana didn't move. Behind her, a horn blared, then another. She barely heard them. Her father was stepping back from the car ahead, tucking the coins into his shirt pocket, adjusting the cooler in both hands. In a moment, he would reach her window. In a moment, he would see her face. She didn't know whether to drive away or to get out of the car entirely. She did neither. She sat, frozen, as his slow steps brought him closer. And then he looked up. "Miss, would you—" He stopped. The cooler swayed in his hands. His mouth opened, then closed. Diana pressed her hand against the window glass as if she could reach through it. "Daddy," she whispered. And though the word was barely sound, barely breath, somehow, he heard it. To understand what that moment meant, and why it contained 19 years of silence within it, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to the beginning. Emmanuel Osei had come to this country with $32, a second-hand suitcase, and an absolute refusal to fail. He was 26 years old, the eldest son of a seamstress and a schoolteacher from Kumasi, Ghana, and he had promised his mother, her small hands holding both of his as he stood at the departure gate, that he would make something of himself. He had promised her that the sacrifice would be worth it. He found work at a textile factory in the industrial part of the city. The hours were punishing. The pay was meager. The dormitory he shared with 5 other men smelled of dampness and fried onions, and the particular exhaustion of men who had traveled far and not yet arrived anywhere. But Emmanuel Osei did not complain. He worked days at the factory and evenings at a grocery store 3 blocks away. He saved every dollar he could. He learned English by reading the newspaper every morning on the bus, mouthing the words quietly so as not to disturb the other passengers. He wrote letters home to his mother every Sunday. He never told her how hard it was. He only told her that things were going well. 5 years after his arrival, he met a woman named Grace at a church potluck dinner. Grace was warm and brilliant, and had a laugh so wide it seemed to fill every corner of a room. They married within a year, and a year after that, Diana was born. Emmanuel held his daughter for the first time in the hospital corridor, the fluorescent lights humming above him, and he wept. Not from sadness, from something much larger than sadness, from the weight of every sacrifice he had made, and every one he was yet to make, and from the absolute certainty, which landed in his chest like a stone, that she would never have to struggle the way he had struggled. Never. Not while he was breathing. From that day forward, Emmanuel Osei lived for one purpose: to give his daughter the life he never had. He worked. Lord, how he worked. He worked when his back ached and his hands cracked in the winter cold. He worked through illnesses he ignored, and holidays he shortened, and celebrations he left early. He attended every parent-teacher conference in his factory clothes, smelling of machine oil, and sat in those small chairs with the same quiet dignity with which he had once sat before village elders. He attended because Diana mattered, because Diana was everything, and Diana was brilliant. She was the kind of child who read ahead of her class and then wrote stories about what she'd read, just for the pleasure of it. She was curious and focused and deeply observant, always watching, always thinking. Her teachers adored her. Her father adored her more. Every evening after dinner, Emmanuel would sit at the kitchen table while Diana did her homework, and he would pretend to read the newspaper. But really, he was watching her think, watching her grow. "Study hard," he told her, every single night, every night for years. "Study hard, Diana. One day, you will have a life far better than mine. One day, everything I have done will make sense." She always looked up from her books and smiled at him. "Yes, Daddy." She meant it. And for a long time, it was enough. Diana was 17 when her mother, Grace, was diagnosed with a heart condition that required expensive treatment. Emmanuel never let Diana see how frightened he was. He sold his car. He took extra shifts. He borrowed from cousins he hadn't spoken to in years. He navigated hospitals and insurance forms and medical jargon with the same stubborn, methodical focus he applied to everything. Grace recovered. It took 2 years and almost everything Emmanuel had saved. But she recovered. He never mentioned the money to Diana. Not once. She only found out years later from an aunt at a family gathering who mentioned it casually, as if it were simply a known fact, the kind of thing a father does, the kind of thing Emmanuel did. Diana got a full scholarship to university. The day the letter arrived, Emmanuel read it 3 times at the kitchen table, then folded it precisely and placed it in the inside breast pocket of his good jacket, close to his heart. He told Grace. He needed to step outside for a moment. He stood on the small porch of their rented house and cried quietly for 7 minutes. Then he came back inside, made tea, and said, "We always knew she would." That was Emmanuel Osei. University changed Diana, not immediately, not obviously. It happened the way most significant changes happen, gradually and then all at once. She was brilliant. Everyone told her so. And for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who were also brilliant, and also ambitious and polished, and who spoke in ways that made her hyper-aware, suddenly, of the small imprecisions in her own speech, of the second-hand coat she wore in winter, of the way she sometimes flinched when people asked about her parents' jobs. She was not ashamed of her father. She told herself this constantly. She was not ashamed. She loved him. But love and awareness are not always comfortable companions. She began coming home less frequently. She told herself it was because she was busy. And she was busy, extraordinarily so, building a career trajectory with the same intensity her father had always told her to apply to her studies. Emmanuel and Grace accepted her absences with grace, as was their nature. They called every Sunday. Emmanuel always asked the same questions in the same order. How are you eating? How is the work? Are you sleeping enough? And then, always, finally, are you happy? She always said yes. The first crack in their relationship appeared during Christmas of Diana's 3rd year of work, when she brought home a colleague, a man named Sterling, whose family owned several businesses, and who had never once in his life worried about money. Sterling was pleasant enough, but at dinner he made an offhand remark about Emmanuel's factory work, something mild, perhaps even intended to be admiring, and Emmanuel's face did something Diana had never seen it do. It closed, just briefly, just for a second. But she saw it, and in her embarrassment, which she was ashamed of being embarrassed about, she said something sharper to her father than she intended. Something about him not needing to tell the same stories. Something that came out harder than she meant. Emmanuel said nothing. Grace changed the subject. Sterling did not stay long. And on the drive back, Diana told herself it was nothing. Just a rough evening. Just a misunderstanding. It would pass. It didn't pass. The larger fight happened 3 years later. By then, Diana had risen quickly in her company, had moved into the condo on the 23rd floor, and had begun to feel, for the first time, like the life her father had always dreamed for her was genuinely, concretely, within reach. She had also, without quite realizing it, been subtly pulling away for years. Fewer calls, shorter visits. The Sunday calls had become every other week, then once a month. She was busy. She was building something. She told herself they understood. When she finally came home for a visit that spring, she found the house smaller than she remembered. Her mother had aged quietly and gracefully. Her father had aged harder. There was a weariness to him now, a heaviness in how he sat. Over dinner, Grace gently raised the question of whether Diana might help them with some of the bills. Not dramatically, just a mention that the factory hours had been cut, and that there were a few things that had become difficult. Before Diana could respond, Emmanuel put down his fork. "We don't need anything," he said firmly. "We are fine." "Daddy," I said, "we are fine." Diana looked at her mother, who looked at the table. She looked back at her father, at the proud set of his jaw, at the quiet fury behind his eyes that wasn't directed at her. She understood, even then, but at his own circumstances. "Daddy, I have money now," Diana said. "I can help. I want to help. Why is it a problem if I—" "Because I am your father." His voice was steady, absolutely steady. "I am your father, and I do not take money from my child. I provided for you. I will provide for myself." "That's not how it works anymore." "It is how it works in this house." "Then maybe I should stop coming to this house," Diana said. The words arrived before she had decided to say them. She heard them as if someone else had spoken them. The kitchen was very quiet. Emmanuel looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not angry. It was something worse. It was wounded. And beneath the wound, something had hardened. "If that is what you choose," he said quietly, "then that is what you choose." She left that evening. She told herself she'd call in a few days, a week at most. Weeks became months. Months became years. Grace called several times in the first year, gentle and pained, asking her to reach out to her father. Diana always said she would. She always meant to. And somehow, 19 years went by. How? Does 19 years disappear? It disappears the way all time disappears when we are moving, in the blur of motion, in the noise of living, in the quiet avoidance of the things that hurt. Diana threw herself into her career with a ferocity that left little room for anything else. She rose. She achieved. She built the life her father had always dreamed for her, and she told herself that this was enough, that honoring the dream was the same as honoring the dreamer. She didn't know. She couldn't have known because she had stopped asking, that in those 19 years, her mother Grace had quietly passed away from a second heart episode. That Emmanuel, too proud to call his daughter with the news, had stood at Grace's grave alone, except for a few neighbors and a pastor he barely knew. She didn't know that 2 years after Grace's death, the factory that had employed Emmanuel for 30 years closed without warning, and that Emmanuel had found himself at 68 years old, with no income, a small amount in savings, and a pride so enormous and so deeply woven into his identity that it had become both his greatest strength and his most devastating flaw. She didn't know that her father had tried, methodically and without complaint, every avenue available to a man his age: job applications, pension inquiries, part-time work at stores and parking lots, and that the world had, with tremendous indifference, turned him away at each one. She didn't know that he had ended up selling ice cream because a young man in the neighborhood had a cart and had offered to share the territory, and that her father had accepted not because it was a good option, but because it was the only one that didn't require him to ask anyone for anything. She didn't know any of this, because she hadn't asked. If you're still watching with us right now, type "I'm still here" in the comment section. This story isn't easy, but neither is life, and we think you're here because you understand that. The traffic behind the black SUV had grown chaotic. Horns were going. Someone had gotten out of their car 2 vehicles back and was gesturing with both arms. Diana did not care. She was out of the SUV. She had simply opened the door and stepped out into the lane, not entirely sure when she had decided to do it. She was standing on the hot asphalt, in her blazer, in the middle of afternoon traffic, looking at her father. Emmanuel had not moved. He stood holding his cooler, looking at his daughter, at this woman who had been a girl the last time he saw her, this woman who now had lines at the corners of her eyes and silver at her temples and something terrible and raw moving across her face. "Daddy," she said again, full voice this time. His chin trembled. "Diana." His voice was barely above a whisper. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and put her arms around him, cooler and all. She felt how thin he was. She felt the heat in his shirt from the sun. She felt him go very still, the way a person goes still when they are working hard not to break. And then his arms came around her, slowly, the way they had when she was small and the world was simpler. And she felt his breath leave him in something between a sigh and a sob. "Why didn't you call me?" she managed into his shoulder. "Daddy, why didn't you call me?" He said nothing for a long moment. Around them, the traffic had somehow sorted itself out. Some cars had changed lanes, others had waited with unexpected patience. A few drivers watched through their windows. Something shifted in their expressions. When Emmanuel finally spoke, his voice was quiet and even, the way it always was. The way it was when he was controlling something large. "Because," he said slowly, "I did not want my problems to become your burden." She pulled back. She looked at his face, the same face. Older, deeper, worn by years she hadn't witnessed, but the same eyes that had read her report cards with such quiet pride, the same jaw, the same dignity that had filled every room he'd ever entered. "I'm your daughter," she said. "Your problems are supposed to be my burden. That's how it works. That's how it's supposed to work." He looked at her for a long time. "You were angry with me," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement, offered gently, the way Emmanuel Osei had always handled hard truths. "Yes. I was angry with you also. I know. And yet," he said, looking down at the cooler in his hands, "every day I walk this road, I think, Diana would laugh at this. She would tease me about this. She would say, 'Daddy, you and your pride.'" A small, broken smile. And I would argue with her, and she would win, as she always did, and we would both be happy. Diana pressed her hand over her mouth. "I missed you every day," he said. "Every single day." She didn't let him finish the route. She put the cooler in the back of her SUV. She drove her father to a diner 3 blocks away, the kind of quiet place with vinyl booths and coffee that came in heavy ceramic mugs. They sat across from each other for 4 hours. He told her about Grace, about the diagnosis, about the funeral. He watched her face as he said it and didn't look away, because Emmanuel Osei had never been a man who looked away from difficult things. Diana cried. She cried in the way you cry when grief has been postponed so long that it arrives not as rain, but as a flood. He reached across the table and held her hand. "She knew you loved her," he said. "She never doubted it. Neither did I. Not truly." "I should have called," Diana said. "I should have called so many times. I kept thinking I would, and then time does that," Emmanuel said. "It moves whether we are ready or not. I was so angry about so little," she said. "And I was too proud," he said. "Pride is a thief, Diana. It steals time from you and calls itself dignity." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I spent 19 years selling my pride at full price. I should have sold it for nothing and spent the time with my daughter." She laughed despite herself, a wet, broken laugh, and he smiled, and for a moment they were simply a father and daughter sitting in a diner together, the way they should have been 100 times over the years they had lost. The rebuilding was not instantaneous. Nothing real is. There were weeks of adjustment, of long phone calls and halting conversations, and the particular awkwardness of 2 people learning, again, how to be in each other's lives after an absence so long it had started to feel permanent. There were moments when Diana said the wrong thing, and caught herself and started again. There were moments when Emmanuel retreated into his old silence, and she had to coax him back, gently, persistently. She found him an apartment close to hers, not too close, because Emmanuel Osei was a man who needed his privacy and his independence, and she understood that now in a way she hadn't before. She did not try to simply swallow him into her life. She tried, instead, to make space for his life beside hers. She learned things about her father she had never known, that he loved chess, had played in a small club at the factory every Friday for 20 years before it closed, that he had continued writing letters home to Ghana even after his own mother passed, to cousins, to old friends, maintaining connections with the same faithfulness with which he had once maintained everything. That he had never stopped reading the newspaper on the bus, still mouthing the words sometimes, an old habit he'd never seen a reason to break. She told him things in return, about the years, about the career, about the loneliness she had never quite admitted to herself, about the way she had sometimes driven past the neighborhood where she grew up, not quite stopping, not quite able to explain why. She slowed down. Emmanuel listened. He always had been a better listener than talker. He listened the way he had when she was young and doing homework at the kitchen table, with full and steady attention. "Were you proud of me?" she asked him once, on a Sunday afternoon, the two of them sitting on his small balcony with cups of tea. He turned to look at her. "Diana," he said, with a patience that suggested the question had slightly astonished him. You are, the greatest achievement of my life. Greater than anything I ever did for myself. Every single thing I ever worked for was pointing at you. Of course I was proud. I was always proud." "You never said it," she said. "Not in so many words." He considered this. "I said it every morning I got up before sunrise to go to work. I said it every time I sat in those small chairs at your school. I said it in every letter I wrote home. My daughter, my Diana, she is remarkable. I said it in every way I knew how to say it." A pause. "I am sorry it did not reach you clearly enough." Diana looked out at the small view from his balcony, a stretch of rooftops, a slice of sky, a distant water tower going orange in the late afternoon light. "It reached me," she said. "I just wasn't listening the right way." There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from nearly losing them, from understanding how close you came to a silence that would have been permanent, from sitting across a diner table from your father and knowing that if the traffic light had been green, if you had been looking at your phone, if he had been on a different street on a different afternoon, you would have driven past him and never known. The grief sits differently than the other kind. It is shadowed by relief, by gratitude, by a ferocity about the time that remains. Diana began calling her father every morning. Not long calls, necessarily. Sometimes just 5 minutes. Sometimes just to hear his voice say, "Good morning," and to say it back. It was such a small thing, the smallest possible thing. It turned out to be the most important part of her day. She accompanied him, once, on his ice cream route. This was before she had helped him find other options. This was in the early weeks, when things were still being sorted out. She walked beside him on the hot pavement, carrying the cooler, while he made change and handed out the bars. And she watched the way he greeted each customer with the same courteous warmth, the same unhurried dignity. A child pressed up against a car window waving. Emmanuel laughed and went over, and Diana watched her father's face open completely, the way it used to open at her school events, at her graduation, at every moment when she had given him cause to feel joy. "You're really good at this," she said when they moved on. He shrugged. "I am good at whatever I do." "You know that." She laughed. "Yes, I know that. But, he said, glancing at her sideways, I would rather be good at being your father again, if the position is still available. She took his arm. The position, she said, has been available for 19 years. I've just been terrible at the hiring process. He patted her hand. They walked on. There is something our culture often gets wrong about pride. We treat it as a virtue, and sometimes, in the right measure, it is. Pride in work well done. Pride in character. Pride in having stood up and continued when everything pushed you down. But there is another kind of pride, the kind that masquerades as strength while quietly doing the work of fear. The pride that says, I will not ask for help, because asking is weakness. The pride that says, I will not show my struggle, because struggle is shameful. The pride that says, I would rather lose my daughter than have her see me need something. That kind of pride is not a virtue. It is a wall. And like all walls, it keeps out the bad weather. And also the people who love you. Emmanuel had spent 19 years on one side of that wall. Diana had spent 19 years on the other. Neither of them had been happy about it. Neither of them had entirely understood, until that afternoon at a red light, how permanent the wall had threatened to become. What broke it was not grand or dramatic. It was a red light. An old man with a cooler. A woman who happened to look up at the right moment. Life rarely announces its turning points in advance. Months later, on an evening in late autumn, Diana sat in her father's apartment watching him beat her methodically at chess for the third time in a row. The city moved outside the window, lit up and ordinary. Tea cooled on the small table between them. Her father's face was focused and serene, exactly as it always was when he was winning at something he was very good at. You're doing that on purpose, she told him. I'm doing my best, he said, moving his bishop with quiet finality. Check. She stared at the board. How are you doing that? I learned chess at the factory, he said. 30 years of practice. You have been playing for 4 months. I thought you'd go easier on me. You are my daughter, he said with great dignity. I do not go easy on people I respect. She laughed, and he laughed, and the sound of it filled the small room and went out into the evening. There is a question worth sitting with. Not a comfortable question, but a real one. If you suddenly saw someone you loved struggling on the side of a road, someone you had lost touch with, someone you had let pride or anger or the sheer momentum of busy living pull you away from, what would you do? Would you drive past? Would you freeze? Would you get out of the car? Most of us believe, when we imagine the moment, that we would do the right thing. That love would be enough. That we would not be the kind of person who drove past. But the truth is, we don't usually get a cinematic red light moment to help us recognize the person we've been neglecting. The truth is, the people we are losing are usually not visible enough, not dramatic enough, not standing in the middle of traffic with a small cardboard sign. They are just there, in a house somewhere, in a nursing home somewhere, at the other end of a phone that hasn't rung in too long. And the cost of reaching out is so small. A phone call, a drive, and I was thinking about you. And the cost of not reaching out is so devastatingly, irreversibly large. Emmanuel and Diana Osei found their way back to each other because of a red light and an ice cream cooler and the particular grace of a moment that refused to be missed. Not everyone gets that moment. The people who love you may not be waiting at a traffic light. They may just be waiting. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you have been meaning to call, or a conversation you have been putting off, or a relationship that has been quietly waiting for you to return to it, do not let this moment pass the way so many moments do. Sometimes the greatest distance between people isn't miles, it isn't years, it is pride. And sometimes life gives us one unexpected moment to fix what we thought was broken forever. Don't wait for the red light. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own silence, your own pride, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video and leave a comment. Tell us, have you ever lost touch with someone important and found your way back? Or is there someone you're still waiting to reach out to? And if you want more stories like this, stories about life, about family, about the moments that arrive without warning and change everything, subscribe to this channel. We are here every week. We will be here when you need a story that feels true. Because the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us it is not too late. Until it is, don't let it be too late. We will see you in the next one.